Okay, we'll start with this. A tweet from Everything Boxing reads, Terrence Crawford with the head of Sky Sports Boxing, Adam Smith, and BOXXER promoter, Ben Shalom. Josh Taylor fights on a BOXXER show on Sky Sports Boxing in 11 days' time. Hashtag boxing, hashtag Taylor Catterall. Could we see Crawford versus Taylor in 2022 in the UK on Sky Sports box office? That's the question, since Terrence Crawford is between promoters right now. We know that he's burned that bridge with Top Rank. No new news in reference to the lawsuit he's filed against Top Rank.
No new news in reference to his promotional situation.
We know that signing American talent isn't outside the realm of possibility for Sky Sports and BOXXER, because they very recently signed Clarissa Shields, and she's already made her BOXXER Sky Sports debut. It's possible.
Is it possible the same thing might happen with Terrence Crawford?
I wouldn't rule it out. And I wouldn't rule it out because there's not much left for Josh Taylor to do at 140 pounds outside of satisfying his mandatory challengers by way of the alphabets, the WBA, the WBC, the WBO, and the IBF. Those fights with those mandatory challengers, they're not exactly big fights, not fights on the scale of a Terrence Crawford fight. The day that Josh Taylor decides to move up in weight, at least by the WBO, by way of the WBO, he may effectively become Terrence Crawford's mandatory challenger so long as Terrence can hang on to that WBO title. Those things in mind, and that being said,
that's what happened after Terrence Crawford became the undisputed champion at 140 pounds and moved up to 147.
Exact same thing happened when Alexander Usyk became the cruiserweight division's undisputed champion, and he moved up to heavyweight. He effectively became the WBO's mandatory challenger. The exact same thing could happen with Josh Taylor. And when that happens, somebody's going to have to foot the bill. Somebody's going to have to pay to get the fight done. I don't think it's going to be Top Rank given what's going on right now, but who's to say that Sky Sports and BOXXER can't foot the bill? Does Sky Sports and BOXXER need approval from Top Rank and ESPN to work with Terrence Crawford independently for such a fight? I don't see Josh Taylor doing much boxing on this side of the Atlantic Ocean at this point. I don't.
In America, Josh Taylor's promoted by Top Rank.
But in the UK, he's affiliated with BOXXER and Sky Sports. So there's a legitimate question there. If and when the day comes that Josh Taylor's ready to move up, if that day just so happens to be in the near future, can Sky Sports and BOXXER orchestrate the fight between Terrence Crawford and Josh Taylor without Top Rank?
Josh's next fight is Jack Catterall,
his WBO mandatory challenger. Should Josh Taylor make it through that fight and take care of Jack Catterall, how much longer does he stay at 140 pounds? Does he move up to take on Terrence Crawford afterwards? Does he push for that fight? Because he has expressed an interest in that fight in the past. It's one of the bigger fights he can have.
Not much at welterweight has changed.
Josh Taylor could see himself being frozen out at welterweight in all the ways that Terrence Crawford has been frozen out at welterweight by the PBC, who for the most part still have the run of the place. Most of the alphabet titles are on that side of the street. Very soon, Errol Spence Jr., he's going to be taking on Yordanis Ugas in their 3-belt unification match. Beyond that, the winner of that fight may have to satisfy a mandatory challenger in either Iman Testanionis or Radzav Butaev by way of the WBA. Whichever one of them wins that fight by way of the IBF, they may have to face either Castillo Clayton or Jaron Boots Ennis.
Don't forget, Keith Thurman wants the winner of that fight as well.
Keith Thurman is angling for a shot at the winner of Spence versus Ugas. What that essentially means is that Terrence Crawford is still, for the most part, frozen out of the welterweight scene, that welterweight picture, and in some ways, so is Josh Taylor, because the day he moves up in weight, hey, he's a top-ranked fighter in all the ways that Terrence Crawford was a top-ranked fighter. So he'd have the same problem. Thus, for Josh, Terrence is likely his only option at 147 pounds. And you'll excuse me for saying so, but Josh Taylor's a big guy for super lightweight or junior welterweight. He's big for 140 pounds. He can't make that weight forever.
Maybe he decides he's going to move up after the Catterall fight.
And maybe Sky Sports and BOXXER don't need to deal with Top Rank necessarily to do that fight on their own dime. Do the fight and work with Terrence Crawford independently as far as where us Americans might see the fight here in the U.S., even if ESPN and Top Rank don't air the fight here stateside based on the lawsuit, based on what's going on. It could always end up on Fight TV the way Eubank versus Williams did.
And maybe that's a conversation Terrence had with Adam and Ben.
He's over there in the UK right now to work Amir Khan's corner. For those that are not aware, Amir Khan has enlisted the aid of Terrence Crawford and Brian Bomac McIntyre in preparation for this weekend's big showdown, his domestic rival, Kell Brock.
We're going to be talking about that fight as the fight date approaches.
Who's to say that this isn't a conversation that he hasn't already had now that he's over there across the Atlantic Ocean in the United Kingdom with Adam Smith, with Ben Shalom, about what's next for him moving forward. There's not a lot left for Josh Taylor to do at 140 pounds, and I don't imagine that's a weight for Josh that's getting any easier to make. Terrence Crawford, he's between promoters. He needs fights. He hasn't retired.
This is a distinct possibility based on the landscape.
Because the PBC still has the run of the place, because they're still insistent on keeping everything in-house, because of the proliferation of mandatory challengers lining up for the winner of Spence versus Ugas, it's conceivable that for Terrence Crawford, this might be his only option, and the same applies to Josh Taylor.
Just something to think about.
Irrespective of whatever Terrence has going on with his former promoter, Top Rank, that doesn't necessarily mean he can't work with Sky Sports and BOXXER independently. After all, it's not Sky Sports and BOXXER he's got an issue with.
I don't imagine Bob Arum's going to be too happy about that.
He can't stop them, can he? And just in keeping with the theme of welterweight news, per tweet from Dan Raphael, the purse bid has been scheduled for the IBF welterweight eliminator for a mandatory position between Jaron Boots Ennis and Canadia's own Custio Clayton. This is the official paperwork sent out today, #boxing. On January 20th, 2022, the IBF ordered Jaron Ennis and Custio Clayton to begin negotiations for the IBF welterweight eliminator for #1 position. An agreement could not be reached within the time frame set forth by the IBF. The IBF is now ordering a purse bid in these offices on Tuesday, March 1st, 2022 at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Bids must be submitted at 11:45 a.m. Eastern Time to be promptly opened at 12 p.m. In order to participate in a purse bid, the promoter's annual registration fee corresponding with the bout the participant is bidding on must be paid to the IBF at least 5 days prior to the initial date scheduled for the purse bid. At the time of the bid, promoters must submit a $5,000 non-refundable participation fee in the form of a check, money order, or bank wire transfer. In addition, the participating promoter must also submit at the time a check, money order, or bank wire representing 10% of the total amount of the bid within 5 business days following the purse bid procedure. The winning promoter must forward another payment to this office representing 10% of the bid for a total of 20% of the total amount bid. I have attached the IBF's rule governing purse bids. Please be guided accordingly and refer to the minimum bids per weight class.
Sounds very expensive.
This fight at 147 pounds doesn't have the profile that Spence versus Ugas has, or even a potential Crawford versus Josh Taylor fight, if and when Josh Taylor decides to move up. But make no mistake, this is an important fight to the division, a particularly important fight for unbeaten up-and-comer Jaron Boots Ennis, who's developed a bit of a cult following. They believe he is the heir apparent to the welterweight throne. The problem is that he's not actually an, according to Hoyle, PBC fighter. He hasn't had access to those guys. Oh, he might fight on Showtime the way some PBC fighters fight on Showtime, though he's not an, according to Hoyle, Heyman fighter just because he fights on Showtime. Custio Clayton.
Unbeaten Custio Clayton.
If Jaron Boots Ennis gets through that guy, he becomes the mandatory challenger by way of the IBF for the winner of Spence versus Ugas. And what you have to ask yourself is,
do you think the winner of that fight is going to fight this guy?
It'll be a high-risk, low-reward situation for the winner of Spence versus Ugas, who won't have just one, but two mandatory challengers challengers lying in wait. The winner of Radzav Butaev versus Eimantas Stanionis, and the winner of this fight, the winner of Ennis versus Clayton. How do you think that situation is going to play out?
I can only deduce that the Ennis people and the Clayton people weren't able to reach a deal amongst themselves.
An obvious inference we can make since this purse bid has been ordered. A deal hasn't been reached by the prescribed deadline. In an ideal world, I think the winner of this fight would move straight into a Keith Thurman fight.
Keith Thurman?
Why Keith Thurman, you ask? Well, think about it this way. There are several guys in the queue, the winner of this fight among them, and Keith behind them. Now, Keith has a bigger name than either Castillo Clayton or Jaron Boots Ennis, but the winner of Jaron Boots Ennis versus Castillo Clayton may not be fast-tracked to the winner of Spence versus Ugas straight away. They may have to face the winner of Butaev versus Stanionis first, since that's the fight that made the unification match possible. Eimantas Stanionis standing down. That is in order that
order from the WBA came down last year.
Thus, it requires reconciliation ahead of a potential order from the IBF for the winner of Spence versus Ugas to face the winner of this fight. What makes sense to me, in an ideal world, would be Keith Thurman taking on the winner of this fight, since he just so happens to want the winner of Spence versus Ugas. Keith should fight the winner of
this fight, while the winner of Spence versus Ugas takes on the winner of Butaev versus Stanionis.
Keith Thurman himself says, if I have to take another fight before facing Spence versus Ugas winner, so be it.
If he were to take on the winner of this fight and win, he would become the IBF's mandatory challenger.
Former unified welterweight champion Keith Thurman was quoted as saying, "The fighter in me says, give it to me. Let's go. I want to be champion. I want the winner, But there's, a weird little technicality that happened, For some of those who read the article that this was like a WBC title eliminator, I don't know the politics all the time, man. I'm just a performer. I do believe that I should be worthy of challenging any world champion at any given point in time, considering my resume and everything that has happened in my career, but it does feel very good just to be back. So if I have to take on another fight and just keep, like I said, go from being good to being great to being champion, then so be it."
We know that Keith Thurman's not after just any champion at welterweight.
He's not angling for a Crawford fight. He wants the winner of Spence versus Ugas. He added, "I'm so happy to be back. I want to do what I haven't done in the last 2 years," Thurman said. Keith Thurman does want to be an active fighter, so we have to go back, talk to our team, see what's brought to the table through the networks, through Al Heyman, and just go with the flow, man. I just really want to have a more active career. I want to have more performances for the fans. I want to have more performances for myself. But no matter what, if it happens this summer, if it happens back in November and December, Keith Thurman is on the road to being a champion in the welterweight division once again. And he seems to be a few fights out from that, because the winner of Spence versus Ugas may end up having 2 mandatory challengers lying in wait, whereas Keith Thurman, he's not yet mandatory by way of the WBC, his fight with Mario Barrios having been a WBC eliminator, just not a final eliminator. One way that he could advance in the queue is taking on the winner of Clayton versus Ennis.
Reconciliation is required because there's a lot of guys angling for that fight.
I really don't know what's going to happen when the time comes. When the winner of Spence versus Ugas emerges, will they go on to fight the winner of Butaev versus Stanionis? Will they go on to fight the winner of Clayton versus Ennis? Where does Keith Thurman fit into this picture, since he doesn't actually have a claim to fight for any of those alphabet titles? It's a very interesting situation, though in an ideal world, Keith Thurman would have to go through the winner of Clayton versus Ennis, because the winner of Clayton versus Ennis would actually have a legitimate claim to fight for an alphabet title. At this time, Keith Thurman does not.
Keith Thurman, who's rumored to have tanked on pay-per-view in his last fight.
You heard that right, per tweet from Rick Glacier. Keith Thurman's clearly on the back nine as a fighter, now also on the back nine as an attraction. Hashtag Thurman versus Barrios only did a little under 40,000 buys. How bad is that? Pay-per-view buys over-under was set at 50,000 buys, a break-even point. Let's all hope this is a lesson learned for Al Hyman, hashtag PBC, hashtag boxing. And Rick Glacier's number is corroborated by boxing scribe Keith Idek's number, a ballpark that he put out there a few days ago, before Rick put this tweet out there.
Keith said that he heard this pay-per-view did less than half what Crawford versus Porter did.
The Terrence Crawford versus Sean Porter WBO title fight did approximately 130,000 buys on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. Those are the reported buys for that fight. So if Keith Thurman's pay-per-view did less than half that...
Half of 130,000 is 65,000.
Rick Glacier says Keith Thurman's pay-per-view came in just under 40,000.
One set of numbers corroborates the other.
And you'll notice that Mike Coppinger's infamous sources have once again gone quiet. It's been radio silence for this recent string of PBC pay-per-views we've been seeing since late last year. Davis versus Cruz, Martin versus Ortiz, now Thurman versus Barrios. Mike Coppinger's sources haven't given him so much as a ballpark figure as to what those pay-per-views did. And if they have, he hasn't told anybody.
The rule of thumb is if they had something to brag about, they'd be bragging about it.
It appears to me that they are licking their wounds in silence. Mike hasn't released so much as a ballpark figure as to what those pay-per-views did. These are the only numbers out there we have to go off of. And for what it's worth, I believe Keith Idek, I believe Rick Glacier, because what boxing fan was excited to see Keith Thurman coming off a loss take on Mario Barrios coming off a loss at $80 a pop?
You're crazy.
This is what happens when you have these fighters that have no buzz, no momentum, have generated no excitement, have their fights staged behind a paywall. It's a disservice to the fighters, a disservice to the fight fans, and a disservice to the sport overall because that effectively limits how many eyes you get on the fight. And the reason these fights end up behind a paywall is because they're hoping that the fight fans will foot the bill, hoping that the fight fans will pay these fighters the inflated purses they think they deserve, when the reality of it is you ain't got the audience to get paid what you want to get paid.
Get real, buddy.
Two guys coming right off of losses, and one of them hasn't fought in the last 2.5 years. Do you think that generates buzz? Do you think that creates excitement? Enough excitement that the fight fans are going to be reaching for their wallets to pay for this thing? I don't think so, and that much is obvious.
And you know DAZN and Matchroom were staging a card that same night.
That's what I was watching. The Bam Rodriguez versus Carlos Cuadras fight for what was the vacant WBC Super Flyweight title. That was a title fight and a cheaper alternative to Keith Thurman versus Mario Barrios. Two guys coming right off a loss, one of them quite inactive for no title at all.
And I'm supposed to pay $80 to see that.
Keith Thurman gave a lot of speeches ahead of that Mario Barrios fight, that Mario Barrios pay-per-view. A lot of speeches that seem to have fallen on deaf ears in light of these ballpark figures, these rumored numbers. You might be telling yourself, don't make light of the gossips as they are just gossips, but oftentimes that's what these reported numbers are, just gossips and whispers.
It's all the same. These are the numbers that are out there.
Realistic numbers, if you ask me, because nobody was excited to see Keith Thurman boxing Mario Barrios. Let's be serious here.
If Thurman versus Porter only did 130,000, what, you thought this was going to do more than that?
Are you stupid or something?
You thought more people were excited to see Thurman versus Barrios than Crawford versus Porter. That's what you thought.